Hi, today I'm going to talk about the psychoanalytic understanding of conspiracy theories, cults, addictions, virtue signaling, victimhood, phobia, and free speech. So, one of my main arguments is that only psychoanalysis can really explain these things, and that if we don't understand the counterintuitive nature of psychoanalytic thought, then it's going to be hard to really grasp the radical nature of some of these aspects of the human experience. So, one thing when we're talking about conspiracy theories, if you look at Freud's fundamental theory about consciousness and thought, we realize that we naturally tend towards conspiracy theories. And one of the things we want to ask is how do we define consciousness? And I believe the best way to define human consciousness is through thought and to realize that computers and other animals don't think. And so, once again, we have to ask, so what is thought exactly? Now, for Freud, thought is defined by the primary processes, meaning the processes of association, substitution, displacement, and projection. And these things happen naturally and automatically. For instance, in our dreams, when you have, say, a figure of your uncle in your uncle is a substitute for someone else, and that other person, the values that you and feelings you attach to that other person are represented by the symbolic substitution, and that these thoughts are experienced directly as perceptions of the external world. So when we have a dream, we are conscious of it and we take it to be real and true. And the same thing happens when we have a hallucination. So, for an example of how the primary processes work, we could take the political example of the effort to create crime, to connect crime to Blackness. And this was done starting after the Civil Rights Act in 1964 as almost an intentional strategy by the Republican Party. But it plays on these processes of taking two things that are different, crime and Blackness, substituting them, and it's displacing the feelings we have about crime onto Blackness, and then accepting this as something natural or something that's not constructed and not the result of human thought. So, a key to understanding our thinking, consciousness, is to realize that it's always indirect, meaning symbolic, that it's irrational, it doesn't distinguish between fact and fiction, and it's unintentional. We have an automatic ability to use rhetoric and poetry. In fact, we can say that rhetoric and poetry are derived from these automatic processes. And for Freud, he argued that the first stage of human civilization is what he called animism, the belief that non-human things have human characteristics, that everything is alive. And one of Freud's ideas here is that this notion of projection, where you take a internal thought, but you perceive it as external reality, is the key to our initial state of both being an individual, but also of civilization. And this confusion between thought and reality also often equates correlation and association with causation. And so at the bottom of our thoughts, all thinking is paranoid knowledge. And we see this in Descartes, right before he says, I think, therefore I am. He says, I could be dreaming now. The only thing that I know is that both in the dream world and the real world, I am thinking. So I think, therefore I am. So right off the start of the Enlightenment, thought is defined by this process of projection and the use of the primary processes. So we have to ask, if it is natural to have conspiracy theories, if it is natural to have paranoid knowledge, the question then becomes, for psychoanalysis, how do we stop it? This notion of conspiracy theories can also be related to cults. One of the things we have to ask is, why do people buy into their own oppression and exploitation? Well, what Freud does, he shows that at the bottom of all culture is the idea of cults, that therefore there's a spectrum, and that all social relations are fundamentally based on trust, faith, tradition, and taken to the extreme, these become cults. So what he looked at was common characteristics of the love relationship, like blind love, of hypnosis, which he started off using in his treatment, where you just take any suggestion that the analyst gives you and you don't question the value of it or the reality of it. And he found the same structure in armies, churches, and political rallies. And the key aspects of this is the notion of idolization. So when we idolize a lover, when we idolize a leader, or we idolize a group or an idea, there is both this combination of deep focus, we ignore everything outside of our focus, and the suspension of critical thought. In terms of social groups, the cult part of culture, we find a symbolic splitting. There's always a strict symbolic opposition between what is good and what is evil, what is value versus what is valued, which is debased, and also it creates a black and white world. Now, the psychoanalytic notion of splitting is this idea that we divide the world through these symbolic categories in order to avoid ambivalence, ambiguity, and ultimately anxiety. And that by splitting the world, we're able to take on a new identification, which gives us an identity and provides meaning. And so you see in social groups, taken to the extreme, in cults, in fascist organizations, the use of uniforms and symbols, but we also find this in perverse relationships like S&M relationships, where people play roles, they often wear uniforms or outfits, and they conform to strict oppositions. You're top or bottom, you're the sadist or the masochist, the voyeur or the exhibitionist. And that the foundation of this desire to have this split world and to idolize the other, Freud puts the escape from freedom, responsibility, guilt, shame, and anxiety. So in other words, if I idolize the other and I say, for instance, that God is responsible for everything, then I'm able to escape my own responsibility. And if I'm not responsible for the world or for what's happening, if this higher power is responsible, then I don't have to worry about guilt and shame. And if I don't have guilt and shame, then I can escape anxiety. And so Freud argued that what happens in an intense love relationship, in the hypnotic relationship, in groups like armies, churches, and in political rallies, is we find the same regression to a state of infantile dependency. And it responds to this primal demand where the child basically turns to the caregiver and expects to gain from the other recognition, knowledge, and care. And so at the bottom of what Freud called transference in its extreme form is this total dependency on an idolized other. And we find the same thing when people get cured by placebos or when they internalize the suggestion of others. They place the therapist, the analyst, the doctor in the position of what Lacan called the one who knows. And within these cult-like structures, what we often find is that one leader or one person plays the role of the primal father. Freud argued at the beginning of civilization, you had a man, a father who controlled, basically he had total freedom and total access to all of the women. And what we see here is this fantasy of total freedom and enjoyment. And this also often results in cults, in someone who's able to profit and exploit other people. And as we also see in cults is there's often the use of castration, meaning a virtual threat, not just to a particular part of the body, but this idea that if you go against the leader, there's going to be some type of violent reaction, which creates then a state of paranoia. Now, psychoanalysis also helps us to understand addiction. And basically, at its foundation, all drives are forms of addiction. So we all have addictions, we all have compulsions, urges that we can't control that are often antisocial and often self-destructive. So even though it seems like someone is being highly selfish, like what we say, the terrible twos, young children who just want what they want when they want it, they often this selfishness can result in self-destruction. Think about the people who refuse to wear masks or because they want to be free, who refuse to get vaccines for their freedom. This type of libertarian ideology is very close to the libertine ideology, the idea that I should be able to enjoy anyone and anything any way that I want. And what Freud also discovered, and this is very counterintuitive, at the foundation of our search for enjoyment, our search for pleasure, is a desire to escape thinking. So he said, at the state of climax, all thought is suspended. And so we see that he breaks down the drives into the aim and into the object. And one of the things he points out is, unlike other animals, our objects are open to both being changed and being triggered by the social environment, but also often become highly fixated. And that at the foundation of this complex and of the Oedipus complex is that someone wants to access the mother or the object, and they want to get rid of anything that gets in the way, like the father. And so he said that the drives are a borderline between the mental and the physical. And here we see kind of the foundations of what is now called the borderline personality. Psychoanalysis also helps us to understand the current phenomenon of virtue signaling. So the idea is, with a narcissistic personality or obsessive compulsive neuroses, there is a great desire to protect the good self, to protect and project the good self, and that this is done through purification rituals. So Freud talks about people washing their hands in order to escape a feeling of guilt or shame. But we can also think of people, for instance, advertising that they belong to a particular political group, or that they've done something extraordinary or interesting on Facebook, as attempts of basically getting other people to recognize that they are good, and that allows them, the individual, to feel like they are good themselves. So the idea is to fortify this idealized self-image by getting other people to recognize your ideal self. And this focus on being seen as good and ideal, it serves, according to Freud, to hide our aggression and our guilt and shame. And so that the way in the compulsive, obsessive compulsive narcissism, the way that we basically try to escape guilt, shame, and anxiety is by going through these purification rituals. And virtual signaling is a form of this type of signaled purification. And in the effort to get recognized by other people as good, one has to conform to the image that other people have of what makes someone good, and one has to do it for another person. So Lacan has this term, one becomes an other for the other. And underlying this desire to be recognized is this underlying insecurity which drives it. If one feels bad about oneself, the solution is to get other people to feel good about you. And you do that by conforming to the standards around you. And so this creates repression, which defines the unconscious, because it creates a self-division and a self-deception between how you present yourself to others and how the underlying insecurity and aggression that you feel. And a key to, we find in narcissistic personality disorder, is that no criticism is tolerated. And so one wants to use the other only to get one's good self verified. Now, the other thing that psychoanalysis can help us to understand is this notion of victimhood and victim identity. And the key to this, and I would say the key to Freud's theory of hysteria, is the manipulation through an unconscious use of emotion. So one is not only manipulating oneself, one is also manipulating others. And one does this by taking on the position of being a victim, by being the one who suffers. And if you are the one who is the victim, then you can consider yourself to be good and innocent, that it is the other who is evil, and that all revenge you have against the other is therefore justified, and no criticism is allowed. After all, you can't go to someone who's suffering from cancer, for instance, and attack them or criticize them. Now, what we find is at the heart of so many wars and at the bottom of so much religious fundamentalism is this identification with victimhood. So, for instance, people wear crosses to show the ultimate scene of victimization of Christ on the cross. Most wars, think of after 9/11, United States declares itself the victim and then is able to attack other countries because it is good, and the other countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, are evil. And at the bottom of so many wars, we find this victim complex. And if you look at Freud's case of Dora, you find out that most of her symptoms, her expressed suffering, come through identification. She sees her father has certain symptoms. She reads about different symptoms in literature, and she sees people around her having certain symptoms. And so, what Freud pointed out in hysteria, there is often this identification through empathy of suffering. And often, then the way that one relates to other people, once again, this is all unconscious. So one is not aware that one is manipulating the other through suffering. And this takes on a passive aggressive form. And Freud argued that underneath this victim complex is a fantasy where one imagines one's suffering. And so Freud has to ask, why would people imagine themselves to be victimized? And what we find out is that it has all of these social reactions that it causes, and that it's a way of both manipulating others and the self. But once again, this is done on an unconscious level, which makes it very hard to deal with. And we see the same thing with psychosomatic illnesses or symptoms. Once again, the mind is able to make the body sick, or the mind is able to take advantage of the suffering of the body. And this suffering then is able to manipulate the relationships one has with other people. So the next concept I want to look at is anxiety. Now, I think that this is the closest we come to a biological evolutionary kind of explanation in psychoanalysis, this idea that we have a inherited response to danger, and that in response to danger, we increase our heartbeat, we increase the energy in our body because we're preparing to either fight or flee. And so this is experienced as anxiety, a built-up of energy and tension that is not being immediately released. But what happens with human beings, as opposed to other animals, is that the threat that causes us to increase anxiety and trigger this biological response is often derived from the primary processes and a form of paranoia or projection. So, for example, think about public speaking. A lot of people today say one of their worst fears is to speak in public. And the fear is, of course, a fear of criticism, a fear of rejection. And so we find here this kind of non-psychotic paranoia and sensitivity, because ultimately what people fear is their own minds. And the same thing with ghosts and other type of scary things that happen. We find the model in dreams where you have nightmares because you can't control your own mind, and your own mind can scare you. Now, of course, this type of anxiety that is then triggered by an object is easily manipulated by the media and by politicians in order to get people to succumb to the solution that the politicians or the media provides. So in terms of free speech, which a lot of debate now in politics is about, on one level, psychoanalysis is all about free speech. It tells the patient to say what is ever on their mind. And the reason, the way that this works is that the analyst refuses to judge the patient, and therefore the patient is supposed to stop censoring and judging themselves. And so here we have total free speech. Of course, society would not work if people walked around constantly saying what was ever on their mind. But psychoanalysis is a practice of radical self-honesty. And in order to do that, you have to overcome the paranoia that makes us fear the criticism of other people. And that through free association, we realize that even though we're saying whatever comes into our head, there's a certain logic and connection between the different things that we say. So Freud wanted us to counter the conspiracy theories of the primary processes with a reality principle. And the idea was that the foundation of modern science was this ability to take a neutral, impartial perspective, to suspend our quick desire to confuse correlation with causation, and that this idea of neutrality, once again, is a necessary but impossible ideal. We never fully are able to be impartial or neutral, but it is this idea that drives this fundamental institution. And the goal then is to create a truth of our inner and outer life.